Ever feel like language barriers can really mess things up?
Oh, yeah.
Imagine being in court and the person translating your testimony just isn't quite getting it right.
Yeah, that's scary.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating Supreme Court case from the Philippines that explores just that.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about Emiliana A. Lumilang, a court interpreter who found herself in hot water over her translation skills or lack thereof.
Ooh.
This is a story about language, law, and the importance of accuracy when the stakes are high.
I'm interested.
It really makes you wonder, how much power does a single interpreter hold when someone's freedom hangs in the balance?
Right, because so much is at stake.
That's a question that goes straight to the heart of fairness and due process, and it's exactly what this case
Yeah.
P-14-3259, decided on November 28, 2019, explores.
Okay, so we're in the Philippines, specifically the regional trial court in Malaybalay City.
Can you set the scene for us?
Sure.
What exactly was Emiliana Lumilang's job,
She was a court interpreter.
and how did she end up in the spotlight?
Well, her job was bridging the communication gap between witnesses or defendants who spoke Visayan and the court proceedings conducted in English.
Okay.
A role that demands precision and a deep understanding of both languages, especially legal terminology.
It sounds like a high-pressure job,
Mm.
especially when you consider that people's lives can be drastically affected by the accuracy of the translations.
Absolutely, and that's why this case garnered so much attention.
So how did it all begin?
It all started with an anonymous complaint, filed back in 2008, alleging that Lumilang's English skills were so poor that her translations were riddled with errors.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
The complaint claimed that these errors were so severe that they could potentially compromise the fairness of the trials.
An anonymous complaint.
Yeah.
That's intriguing. It sounds like someone felt strongly that something wasn't right, but was maybe hesitant to come forward publicly.
Right.
So what happened?
Well, the complaint went straight to the Office of the Court Administrator. Think of it as the internal affairs branch of the Philippine court system, and they launched an investigation to get to the bottom of these accusations.
So what did this investigation involve? Was it just a matter of looking at some transcripts and comparing them to the original Visayan testimony?
It went far beyond that.
Really?
Yeah, the investigation spanned years and involved interviews with court personnel, lawyers who had appeared before the court where Lumilang worked, and even a review of her performance evaluations.
Wow.
They wanted to understand if this was an isolated incident or if there was a pattern of concern regarding her translation abilities.
Years.
Yeah.
That's a serious commitment to getting the facts straight.
Right.
It makes you wonder what Emiliana Lumilang's response to all of this was. Did she try to defend herself against these allegations?
Yes, she did.
Okay, good.
Lumilang maintained that she had always performed her duties diligently and that the complaint against her was baseless. She argued that her primary responsibility was to translate what she heard, not to perfectly transcribe every word in a stenographic fashion.
That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
It brings up the question of how much leeway a court interpreter has in conveying meaning, especially when dealing with legal nuances.
You've hit on a key point here.
Okay.
Court interpreters are often walking a tightrope between literal translation and conveying the intended meaning within the context of the legal proceedings.
Right.
And of course, in this case, the investigation had to determine if Lumilang had crossed a line, if her interpretations were so flawed that they jeopardized the fairness of the trials.
So what did the investigation ultimately uncover? Was there enough evidence to support the claims made in the anonymous complaint?
Well, the investigation, unfortunately for Lumilang, revealed a pattern of concern regarding the accuracy of her translations.
Uh-oh.
Multiple individuals testified to her struggles with English and pointed out repeated instances of errors in her interpretations.
Oh, no.
It wasn't looking good.
It sounds like the investigation was building a strong case against Lumilang. But did it stop there? What happened after the Office of the Court Administrator finished their investigation?
This is where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
The case, because of the seriousness of the allegations, ended up being elevated to the highest court in the land,
To where?
the Philippine Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
Yes,
This local interpreter case really escalated quickly.
it did.
What were the key issues the Supreme Court had to grapple with when reviewing this case?
Essentially, they had to determine whether Lumilang's performance as a court interpreter met the standards required by the Philippine Constitution, which mandates that public servants must perform their duties with competence and efficiency.
It sounds like they were trying to decide if her alleged shortcomings were serious enough to constitute a violation of her responsibilities as a public official. What did the Supreme Court ultimately decide? This is where the legal doctrine, public office is a public trust, comes into play, right?
Exactly. This doctrine emphasizes that public officials hold their positions not for personal gain, but for the benefit of the people they serve. It's a cornerstone of democratic governance. In Lumilang's case, the Supreme Court had to determine if her actions, or in this instance, her alleged inactions, constituted a breach of that trust.
So the Supreme Court took this case very seriously. I imagine they carefully reviewed all the evidence presented during the investigation.
Absolutely. They weighed the testimonies of those who had raised concerns about Lumilang's translations, considered her defense, and ultimately reached a verdict.
And what was it? This must have been a nail-biting moment for Emiliana Lumilang.
The Supreme Court, in a decision that sent shockwaves through the Philippine legal community, found Lumilang guilty of inefficiency and incompetence.
Yeah.
They ruled that her failure to accurately translate court proceedings had potentially jeopardized the right of those involved to a fair trial.
A guilty verdict. It makes you think about the weight of those words, inefficiency and incompetence, and how they can impact a person's career and reputation.
Yes, it's a stark reminder of the high standards expected of those who hold positions of public trust, especially in a field as critical as court interpretation. The Supreme Court didn't take this decision lightly.
So what happened then? What kind of punishment did the Supreme Court hand down?
They suspended Emiliana Lumilang from her position as a court interpreter for 3 months without pay.
Okay.
It was a serious consequence, but the court also acknowledged that this was her first offense. They issued a stern warning, making it clear that any future lapses in her performance would result in even harsher penalties.
So they tried to strike a balance between holding her accountable for her actions and giving her an opportunity to learn from her mistakes. And it also sends a strong message to other court interpreters about the importance of accuracy and professionalism.
Precisely, the Supreme Court's decision underscores that the role of a court interpreter is not simply about linguistic ability. It's about upholding the integrity of the justice system and ensuring that everyone has equal access to a fair trial, regardless of the language they speak.
Which makes me think about the potential consequences of inaccurate translations in a courtroom. Were there specific examples highlighted during the case that demonstrated how Lumilang's alleged errors might have impacted the outcome of a trial?
While the court documents don't go into specific details about individual cases, it's not hard to imagine how even a slight mistranslation could have a ripple effect, potentially influencing witness testimony, the understanding of evidence, or even the judge's perception of a defendant's guilt or innocence.
That's a scary thought. It really highlights how much power rests in the hands of a court interpreter. We've talked a lot about the legal and procedural aspects of this case, but I'm also curious about the human side of the story. What was it like for those involved in the trials where Lumilang's translations were questioned?
You're right. It's important to remember that behind the legal arguments and court decisions, there are real people whose lives were directly affected by this situation. Imagine the frustration of a witness struggling to convey their truth, or a defendant fighting for their freedom, all while feeling like their words are being lost or distorted in translation.
It must have been incredibly stressful for lawyers, too, who are entrusted with advocating for their clients and ensuring their voices are heard clearly.
Absolutely. To have that trust compromised by inaccurate interpretations would be a nightmare scenario for any lawyer. They're already navigating the complexities of the legal system, and then to have this added layer of uncertainty about whether their client's words are being accurately conveyed must have been incredibly difficult.
It makes you wonder, what was going through Emiliana Lumilang's mind during all of this? Was she aware of the gravity of the situation, the potential impact her translations were having on people's lives?
That's a question we can only speculate about, but it's important to remember that court interpreting is a demanding job. You need to be quick on your feet, able to process information rapidly and accurately translate complex legal terminology, often under intense pressure.
It sounds like a mental juggling act. And it raises the question, were there any systemic issues at play that might have contributed to this situation?
That's an excellent question, and one that goes beyond this specific case. It prompts us to look at the bigger picture of court interpretation in the Philippines, and perhaps even globally. Were there adequate training programs in place for court interpreters? Were they provided with the resources and support they needed to succeed?
And what about the working conditions? Were interpreters given sufficient time to prepare for their assignments? Were they compensated fairly for their work, which, as we've discussed, carries such immense responsibility?
These are all crucial questions that deserve attention because ultimately ensuring access to justice isn't just about having a lawyer. It's about ensuring that everyone can understand and be understood within the legal system. And that's where the role of a court interpreter becomes so vital. They are the bridge between languages, cultures, and legal concepts, and their competence can truly be the difference between a fair trial and potential miscarriage of justice.
It's a powerful reminder that even seemingly behind-the-scenes roles can have a profound impact on people's lives.
This deep dive into the case of Emiliana Lumilang has really brought to light the complexities of language and the human element within our justice system.
It certainly has given me a lot to think about. It also highlights the importance of continuous learning and professional development, especially in fields like court, interpreting where the stakes are so high.
Right.
What are your final thoughts on this case? What key takeaways should our listeners keep in mind?
Well, what's fascinating here is how this case, while centered on one individual in the Philippines, really touches on universal themes of justice accountability and the power of language.
It's a reminder that seemingly small details like accurate translations can have a huge impact on people's lives, and that the quest for justice relies on a complex web of people doing their jobs with competence and integrity.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see how this case raises questions not just about individual responsibility, but also about systemic issues.
Like what?
Are we, as a society, providing enough support and training for those who play such crucial roles in our justice system? Are we creating an environment where accuracy and fairness are truly prioritized?
Those are important questions worth pondering. It's easy to get caught up in the specifics of a case like this, but it's important to remember that these issues have far-reaching implications.
You know, it makes you think.
It does.
This raises an important question for all of us.
Okay.
How can we, as individuals and as a society, work to ensure that language barriers don't become barriers to justice?
It's a great question and one that deserves further exploration. This deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
What about you? What are your thoughts on this case? Share your reactions in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more fascinating deep dives into the world around us.